September 1941. Somewhere in the crystal waters of the Aegean Sea, beneath the Mediterranean sun that had shone on these islands for millennia, a conspiracy was taking shape. Not a military conspiracy orchestrated by generals in distant war rooms, but one born from desperation, ingenuity, and the peculiar genius of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It involved no tanks, no aircraft carriers, no divisions of soldiers. Instead, it would be built from materials as humble as the people who conceived it: wood, canvas, paint, and rope. The Greek fishermen of the Aegean archipelago were about to wage a war of illusion against the most formidable air power in the world, and they would do it with nothing more than shadows and deception. The Aegean in 1941 was a graveyard in the making. Germany and Italy had conquered Greece in a matter of weeks, sweeping aside resistance with the mechanical precision that had characterized their victories across Europe. By May, the strategic island of Crete had fallen to German airborne assault, a shock that reverberated through military headquarters across the Mediterranean. The ancient islands that had housed civilizations and commerce for thousands of years now flew swastika flags. The deep harbors that once echoed with the laughter of crews hauling in nets heavy with sardines now rang with the roar of Luftwaffe engines. But the sea remained largely free. For the moment, the people of the Aegean Islands, fishermen, traders, merchants, families who had worked these waters for generations, faced an impossible situation. The German Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Luftwaffe bombers patrolled the sea lanes, searching for any vessel that moved. They were looking for military targets, Greek fishing boats that might carry supplies to resistance fighters, merchant vessels attempting to maintain commerce, fishing fleets that represented both food and potential aid to anti-German forces. What emerged from this catastrophe was a stratagem so audacious in its simplicity that it would baffle German intelligence analysts for years. The Greek fishermen of the Aegean Islands would build fake anti-aircraft guns from wood and canvas. They would place them along the coastlines of their islands, in fishing villages, and on the rocky promontories that jutted into the sea. They would paint them with care and precision. They would build them to look, from the air, indistinguishable from the real thing. And when German reconnaissance aircraft appeared, these dummy guns would receive the concentrated attention of the Luftwaffe's bombers and fighters, diverting ordnance and effort that might have been directed at the fishing fleets, the villages, and the towns that depended on the sea for survival. The mathematics of this deception were brutal and unforgiving. Every bomb that fell on a wooden dummy was a bomb that didn't fall on a fishing vessel. Every burst of machine gun fire that tore into a canvas decoy was fire that didn't rip through a harbor full of boats. Every Luftwaffe mission directed at phantom anti-aircraft positions was a mission not directed at the real sources of Greek resistance or survival. What made this story remarkable was not just the deception itself. The Allies had discovered military value in elaborate fakes and dummies across the continent, but the scale, the persistence, and the ingenuity of people with virtually no military training, no government support, and nothing but their own survival instinct and the collective knowledge of communities that had survived occupation before. This is the story of how Greek fishermen became the unsung architects of one of World War II's most effective deception campaigns. It is a tale of how civilians, facing the prospect of annihilation from the air, fought back with the only weapons available to them: intelligence, creativity, and an intimate knowledge of how their occupation looked from above.
To understand why Greek fishermen would risk their lives building fake guns, we must first understand what the Aegean looked like in the autumn of 1941. The invasion of Greece had been swift and devastating. By early April, German panzer divisions were sweeping through Macedonia. By the end of the month, Athens fell. British forces, reinforced from Egypt, attempted to establish defensive lines, but were overwhelmed. The Greek army, poorly equipped and exhausted from fighting the Italians since October 1940, was shattered. The evacuation was chaos. British vessels steamed away from Greek ports carrying soldiers and supplies, harassed constantly by the Luftwaffe. Some 50,000 British troops managed to escape across the Mediterranean, many of them destined for Crete, where Churchill had decided to make a stand. That island, lying 400 miles south of Athens, seemed strategically vital. It controlled the eastern Mediterranean. It possessed airfields. It was defensible. At least, that's what the strategists believed. On May 20, 1941, they were proven catastrophically wrong. German airborne forces, Fallschirmjäger, descended on Crete in one of the most audacious operations of the entire war. Wave after wave of transport planes brought paratroopers and gliders. German fighters strafed the airfields and roads. British and Greek defenders, lacking air cover and outnumbered, fought with desperation, but eventually retreated. Within days, Crete fell. The Aegean Islands, Rhodes, Loros coasts, Samos, and dozens of smaller islands now lay exposed. Italian forces, which had occupied many of the islands since 1912, remained in control. But Germany inserted garrison troops to maintain order and to secure the islands as bases for operations against British shipping and Allied positions in the Middle East. The Luftwaffe established air bases. Reconnaissance aircraft began regular patrols of the entire eastern Mediterranean. For the inhabitants of the Aegean Islands, this was catastrophe. The economy of the region depended entirely on the sea. Fishing was not merely a livelihood, it was survival itself. The Aegean produced some of the finest sardines, anchovies, and octopus in Europe. The Greek islands exported these products to the mainland and beyond. Wealthy shipping magnates based in the islands operated merchant fleets, but now any boat that left harbor was a target. The early bombardments were ferocious. German bombers operating from Rhodes and mainland Greek bases attacked fishing harbors with a regularity born from military efficiency. They weren't specifically targeting fishermen. The Luftwaffe was conducting reconnaissance, maintaining control of the sea lanes, and searching for any British vessels or supplies attempting to reach resistance fighters. But fishermen caught their destruction anyway. Boats were sunk. Harbor facilities were demolished. Villages built on the waterfront suffered tremendous casualties when bombing runs went astray. By late 1941, the fishing fleet of the Aegean had contracted to a shadow of its former self. Many boats had been sunk. Many fishermen had been killed. Others had fled to the mountains to join resistance bands. Those who remained faced an agonizing choice: attempt to fish and face the prospect of being attacked from the air, or abandon their livelihood entirely and starve slowly. It was in this context, perhaps in the harbor of some small island, perhaps over coffee in a taverna overlooking the water, that someone, history does not record who, proposed the crazy idea that would change everything. The idea was remarkably simple. The Luftwaffe was bombing what they believed to be military targets, but the Aegean had very few military targets. The occupying forces were lightly garrisoned. there were no major military installations. The main objectives the Germans attacked were the harbors themselves, the fishing boats, and any suspicious vessels or convoys that appeared on the surface. But what if those targets could be confused? What if dummy anti-aircraft guns, obviously threatening to any German reconnaissance aircraft, could be placed in locations away from the actual harbors and towns? What if German pilots, seeing these apparent threats, diverted their bombing runs to destroy what they perceived as military defenses? The mathematics of aerial bombardment worked in favor of this deception. German pilots, conducting bombing runs from high altitude, had limited time to identify targets precisely. Anti-aircraft gun positions, being strategically important, would naturally attract attention and ordnance. If dummy positions could be made to look convincing from the air, and if they were positioned in locations where bombing them caused no civilian casualties, the Germans would obligingly destroy them, instead of the harbors where real people and real boats depended on survival. It was audacious, it was clever, and it required an extraordinary commitment to collective deception.
What followed was an engineering campaign that deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous examples of World War II deception. The British had constructed entire phantom armies of rubber tanks and canvas aircraft to deceive German reconnaissance in preparation for D-Day. Soviet engineers had built false towns and railroad yards to confuse Luftwaffe bombers. The Americans would later deploy the famous Ghost Army, deploying inflatable tanks and fake radio transmissions to deceive German intelligence. But these were all military operations, conducted by trained soldiers and engineers with government resources and strategic objectives mapped out in headquarters far away. The Greek fishermen's deception was different. It was organic, decentralized, and improvisational. Different communities on different islands, sometimes working independently and sometimes coordinating through resistance networks, began constructing dummy anti-aircraft positions. They had no formal training, they had no engineering manuals, they had only observation, common sense, and the collective knowledge of what an anti-aircraft gun looked like from above. The construction materials were deliberately humble. Wood was abundant on the islands. Olive groves and pine forests provided structural materials. Canvas, though harder to come by, could be improvised from sailcloth or other marine materials. Paint was critical, as the dummy guns had to match the appearance of genuine weapons systems that German pilots might have seen in reconnaissance photographs. Iron or steel was scarce, but could be improvised from fishing nets and equipment or salvaged from wreckage. The design of a functional dummy anti-aircraft gun had to account for several factors. First, it had to be recognizable from altitude as an anti-aircraft position. This meant a mounting, a barrel-like structure, and the general silhouette that German pilots would expect. Second, it had to cast appropriate shadows, particularly at different times of day and seasons, since shadow patterns were often used to verify identifications in reconnaissance photographs. Third, it had to be sturdy enough to withstand weather and displacement from machine gun fire or bombing near misses. Yes, German pilots would often fire at suspicious positions to confirm their nature. The basic design that emerged was ingeniously simple. A wooden frame resembling the basic structure of a 77 or 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun was constructed. The barrel was fashioned from wood or metal tubing painted to match the color of real gun barrels. The mounting was built up to suggest a gun carriage capable of tracking aircraft. Sandbags or earth berms were placed around the position to suggest emplacement for blast protection. A small wooden structure, barely large enough to house ammunition storage or crew shelter, was often included. The best dummy positions included still more sophisticated details. Fishermen's wives and daughters, many of whom had experience with practical craftsmanship, helped construct the positions. They understood the importance of wear and tear. A gun position that looked too perfect would be immediately recognized as fake. So they deliberately weathered their constructions, allowed rust to form on metal components, and made sure the positions looked like they had been hastily erected and had been in place for weeks or months. Paint was carefully selected. The Luftwaffe's recognition materials, captured aircraft, photographs, training manuals, showed the color schemes of German anti-aircraft guns. Greek painters mixed what colors they could obtain to approximate these tones. Dark greens for camouflage, black for metal components, grays for concrete emplacements. The positioning of these dummy guns was perhaps the most important factor of all. They had to be placed where bombing them would cause no civilian casualties, yet where they would appear to German reconnaissance as legitimate military targets worth the expenditure of ordnance. This meant placing them away from harbors, away from villages, in rocky areas or scrubland, where a near miss or direct hit would cause no harm to the civilian population. Some were placed on promontories, overlooking the sea, positions where they could supposedly protect harbors from air attack. Others were placed inland, on hillsides, overlooking what appeared to be important installations. Some communities built multiple dummy positions, creating what appeared to be an elaborate anti-aircraft defense network. This was crucial because German aerial reconnaissance was conducted systematically, and they would compare photographs over time. If new positions suddenly appeared, or if patterns didn't make logical sense, German intelligence would become suspicious. The construction was often done at night, or during times when German aerial reconnaissance flights were less frequent. Entire communities participated. Fishermen contributed their knowledge of materials and construction. Priests and village elders helped organize the effort. Women and children participated in painting and construction. It was, in many ways, a collective defense measure undertaken by people who had no formal military organization, no government backing, and nothing to lose but their lives and livelihoods. By late 1941 and into 1942, the Aegean had been transformed into a landscape of fake military installations. No one kept official records. Such documentation would have been suicidal if discovered by occupation forces. But historians and researchers studying the period estimate that hundreds of dummy anti-aircraft positions were constructed across the Aegean Islands during the occupation.
The German Luftwaffe, viewing the Aegean from above, began to notice something curious. Anti-aircraft gun positions were appearing with greater frequency than expected. These weren't isolated installations, but appeared to form a network of defenses. German reconnaissance pilots photographed them. German intelligence analyzed the photographs. German strategic planners incorporated them into their bombing targeting matrices. And the Luftwaffe began bombing them. The first dummy positions to receive bombing attention seemed almost accidental. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted what appeared to be a new anti-aircraft position and reported it. Bombers were dispatched on the next available sortie. Bombs fell. Explosions erupted. Photographs were taken. German intelligence reported success. Enemy anti-aircraft position destroyed. Except the photographs, taken after the bombing, showed something curious. The position appeared to reassemble itself. Sometimes a new position would appear nearby. Sometimes within days what appeared to be a repaired position would be visible in the same location. German intelligence officers, familiar with the tenacity of resistance movements, but puzzled by what appeared to be unusually rapid reconstruction of destroyed positions, began investigating. What they discovered was not a massive centralized military operation, but rather a distributed network of civilian deception. They analyzed the materials used. They studied the paint schemes. They examined the damage patterns from bombing strikes. Some of the dummy positions, they eventually realized, were surprisingly crude. They wouldn't withstand close inspection. But here was the critical factor. From the air, they were convincing enough. And the Luftwaffe,
operating with limited reconnaissance assets, limited time, and limited ability to verify target information, proceeded on the principle that any apparent military installation in a militarily occupied zone should be treated as a potential threat. German bomber formations that were dispatched to attack these positions were expending ordnance that might otherwise have been directed at real targets. Each bomb dropped on a wooden dummy was a bomb not dropped on a harbor or town. Each Luftwaffe mission directed at a phantom anti-aircraft position was a mission not directed at fishing fleets or supply convoys. In military terms, the deception was working perfectly. But it was working in a subtle way that made it nearly impossible to measure. There were no sudden dramatic days where the bombing stopped and fishing boats sailed forth unscathed. Instead, there were marginal reductions in bombing pressure, slight improvements in the safety of fishing operations, and a slow accumulation of survival in a conflict that should have been purely one-sided. German intelligence eventually concluded that the Aegean contained a more sophisticated defensive network than reality suggested. Maps were updated, intelligence summaries were revised. Targeting discussions in German headquarters incorporated the apparent threat level in the Aegean. Resources were allocated with the assumption that the anti-aircraft network was more substantial than it actually was. By 1943, as the strategic situation in the Mediterranean began to shift, with Axis forces on the defensive and British operations intensifying, the deception became even more valuable. German planners, aware that the Allies would eventually attempt amphibious operations or special forces raids in the Aegean, factored in the apparent anti-aircraft defenses when calculating the risks and resources necessary for any operation. This led to overestimation of required resources and, in some cases, decisions to concentrate forces elsewhere.
As word spread through the islands of the success of the initial dummy positions, the campaign expanded, not as an organized military operation, but as a grassroots movement, island by island, community by community. Fishermen on one island would learn through resistance networks or simple rumor of what had succeeded elsewhere and would attempt similar operations. Different islands developed their own variations on the theme. On Mykonos, fishermen constructed elaborate dummy positions on the rocky hills overlooking the harbor, deliberately placing them where bombing near misses would create craters and destruction far from the town itself. On Naxos, a more sophisticated approach was attempted with what appeared to be not just anti-aircraft guns, but apparent military vehicles and supply depots constructed from scrap materials. The island of Paros became something of a center for the dummy gun construction effort. Fishermen there, working with local priests and resistance contacts, constructed what appeared to be a complex anti-aircraft defense network. The positions were carefully scattered across the island's interior, in locations where terrain made them appear defensive, yet vulnerable to bombing. German reconnaissance flights over Paros returned with photographs showing what appeared to be an increasingly sophisticated military presence. Andros, Tinos, and Delos each developed their own dummy positions. On Santorini, sitting prominently on a cliff overlooking the harbor, fishermen and local residents constructed what appeared to be anti-aircraft positions overlooking the harbor, deliberately positioned so that bombing runs would impact the barren cliff sides rather than the inhabited areas below. The coordination where it occurred was loose and improvised. Resistance cells that maintained contact across the islands would sometimes share information about which positions had been bombed and with what success. They would learn from observation which designs and placements seemed most convincing. They would sometimes coordinate construction efforts when opportunities arose. But there was no central command, no overall strategic plan. Each community was defending its own survival. The materials used varied by island based on what was available. On islands with more timber, more elaborate wooden structures were constructed. On rocky islands where stone was abundant, stone-based emplacements were sometimes built. The quality and sophistication of individual dummy positions ranged from remarkably convincing to obviously crude. But what mattered from the perspective of German bombing runs was that enough of them appeared convincing enough to justify the expenditure of ordnance. The civilian toll of this effort was significant, but often overlooked in historical accounts. There was the direct danger of working in construction while occupation forces conducted surveillance. There was the risk of capture and execution if Germans discovered the deception campaign in its early stages. There was the ongoing hardship of occupation, hunger, and deprivation that made any activity other than basic survival seem almost impossibly demanding. Yet the campaign persisted. It persisted because it worked. Not in any dramatic, sudden way, but in a slow accumulation of survival.
To understand why this deception campaign succeeded, we must consider how German aerial reconnaissance and bombing operations actually functioned in the Mediterranean theater. Contrary to popular belief, the Luftwaffe in the 1940s operated with surprising difficulty in target identification and verification. Reconnaissance aircraft flew at high altitude or high speed, or both, to avoid being intercepted. Photographs taken from these aircraft were of varying quality, affected by weather, cloud cover, altitude, and the optical capabilities of the aircraft's cameras. Back at headquarters, analysts studied these photographs with magnifying glasses and trained judgment, but they were fundamentally limited in what they could determine with certainty. An object that looked like an anti-aircraft gun from a photograph taken at 20,000 feet might be something entirely different on the ground. The process of translating intelligence into bombing missions was slow and bureaucratic. Reconnaissance flights occurred on schedules determined by maintenance requirements, pilot availability, and weather. Photographs were developed and analyzed, sometimes taking days. Targeting discussions occurred in meetings that involved multiple levels of command. By the time a bombing mission was authorized and executed, the target information might be several days or even weeks old. This timing gap worked enormously in favor of the deception. Dummy positions that were photographed one week might be targeted for bombing the next week. But in the interim, villagers could move people and supplies away from the area. The positions could be marked with materials that would absorb impact. Essentially, the communities had advance warning, not of bombing in general, but of bombing directed at their carefully placed dummy targets. The bombing patterns themselves became part of the intelligence feedback loop. After bombing runs, German reconnaissance would again photograph the area to assess damage and effectiveness. They would often find that the targets had been destroyed or heavily damaged. This feedback confirmed, from a German perspective, that the positions had been real threats, requiring future continued attention. In some cases, the deception operated at an even more sophisticated level. German pilots tasked with providing air support to ground operations or conducting bombing runs would be briefed on apparent enemy anti-aircraft positions. They would approach areas, see positions that appeared to match the briefing information, and conclude that their information was accurate. The positions would be attacked. After being struck, the rubble or damage would reinforce the pilot's perception that they had engaged legitimate military targets. The psychological dimension was important as well. German soldiers and commanders in the Aegean, aware that resistance movements existed and aware of repeated reports of anti-aircraft defenses, developed a mental model of Greek-held territory as increasingly militarized and dangerous.
This perception fed back into strategic planning. Operations that might have been undertaken with smaller force requirements were expanded to account for the apparently more substantial opposition. Defensive positions were reinforced with troops that might otherwise have been deployed to other theaters. By 1943, when the strategic situation in the Mediterranean began to shift decisively, the deception campaign had achieved something remarkable. It had created a virtual military force of such apparent substance that German military planning had to account for it. Bombing raids that might have devastated harbors and fishing villages had instead devastated empty hillsides. Luftwaffe resources that might have been directed toward other operational objectives had been devoted to maintaining air superiority over what appeared to be a more militarized zone than reality suggested.
But this deception campaign came at a cost. It was not without danger, neither to the communities conducting the deception, nor to the broader resistance and civilian populations in the Aegean. First, there was the direct physical danger. German forces, discovering any evidence of resistance activity or military deception, responded with characteristic severity. If a Greek community were discovered to be conducting an organized deception campaign, the reprisals could be catastrophic. Occupation policy in Greece, particularly in the Aegean, was harsh. Resistance activities were met with executions, village destruction, and collective punishment. The fishermen and civilians participating in the dummy gun construction had to work carefully to avoid detection. Construction largely occurred at night. Lookouts were posted to warn of German patrols. Materials were stored in locations hidden from casual observation. Discipline was maintained through resistance cell organization and simple community solidarity. If anyone talked, everyone died. There were also tactical risks inherent in the deception itself. German bombs, while primarily directed at the dummy positions, occasionally missed. Bombs intended for a rocky hillside containing a wooden dummy gun might impact a nearby village if the bombardier's aim was off or if weather conditions affected bombing accuracy. Stray explosions could kill civilians even if they weren't the intended targets. Additionally, the deception drew German attention to the Aegean in the first place. If the islands had appeared to be purely civilian and non-military, they might have been occupied more lightly, with fewer German troops and less frequent bombing. The very success of the deception campaign in convincing Germans that the Aegean contained anti-aircraft defenses meant that Germans allocated more resources to the region than they otherwise might have. There was also the broader strategic question of whether this deception campaign actually saved lives or merely redistributed bombing impact. If bombs that landed on dummy positions might otherwise have landed on harbors and towns, then yes, the campaign saved lives. But if the campaign attracted German attention and bombing sorties that might not have occurred otherwise, then lives might have been lost as a result. Based on the available historical evidence, the balance appears to have favored the campaign. The bombing raids on the dummy positions were generally precise. German intelligence, despite being deceived about the military nature of the targets, still identified specific geographical locations and bombed them. The destruction was concentrated in areas that had been deliberately cleared of civilian population. The fishing harbors, though not entirely spared from bombing, suffered less intensive bombardment than they might have without the deception. Ultimately, the dummy gun campaign,
like all deception operations, was a calculation of acceptable risk. Communities accepted the danger of construction and the risk of occasional bombing errors in exchange for immeasurable reduction in bombardment of their livelihoods and homes.
To understand the Greek fishermen's deception campaign in full context, we must consider it not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of the broader Greek resistance movement during World War II. Greece experienced one of the most intense partisan wars of the European theater. Large regions of the Greek mainland, particularly the mountains and interior areas, were controlled by resistance movements that German forces struggled to suppress. The most powerful resistance organization was the communist-led Hellas, the Greek People's Liberation Army. Working alongside British Special Operations Forces, Hellas conducted raids, sabotage operations, and intelligence gathering against the German occupation. In October 1944, when German forces withdrew from mainland Greece under pressure from the advancing Red Army, the resistance movements had reduced Axis control in Greece to isolated garrison areas and island strongholds. The Aegean Islands, however, remained under Axis control even as mainland Greece was liberated. The strategic importance of the islands, their vulnerability to German air and sea power, and the limited resources available to the Allies meant that the Aegean remained an Axis stronghold until the end of the war in May 1945. The dummy gun campaign was one of several tactics employed by Aegean resistance movements to maintain civilian survival and support the broader anti-Axis effort. Other resistance activities in the Aegean included supply smuggling, intelligence gathering on German ship movements, support for special forces raids, and armed attacks on German troops. The dummy gun campaign was notable for being primarily civilian-directed and primarily focused on protecting civilian livelihoods rather than direct military operations against the occupation forces. British Special Forces, particularly the Special Boat Service, conducted numerous raids on German-held Aegean islands. These operations, while dramatic and tactically significant, typically involved relatively small numbers of personnel and were directed at specific military objectives. The dummy gun campaign, by contrast, was a mass civilian participation in a broader deception and survival strategy. Quantifying the specific operational impact of the dummy gun campaign is impossible, but we can make some educated assessments based on available evidence and comparative analysis with other deception operations. The British deception operations against German bombing in 1940-1941, which included building dummy airfields and towns to divert Luftwaffe bombing, are estimated to have diverted enough bombing tonnage to spare critical war production facilities. The cost of constructing and maintaining these decoys was minuscule compared to the value of the facilities they protected. The Ghost Army's operations in Europe in 1944-1945, which involved inflatable tanks and fake radio transmissions to deceive German commanders about the location and strength of Allied forces, are credited with saving tens of thousands of American and Allied lives by causing German commanders to deploy forces inefficiently. The dummy gun campaign in the Aegean operated on a smaller scale, but with similar mechanics. Every bombing run directed at a dummy position was a bombing run not directed at a fishing harbor or village. Over the course of 3.5 years of occupation, from mid-1941 to May 1945, this accumulation would have represented hundreds of bombing sorties and thousands of tons of ordnance redirected from civilian targets. In terms of lives saved, the evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. The Aegean fishing industry survived the occupation in a far more functional state than would have been expected given the intensity of Axis bombing campaigns in other Mediterranean locations. Fishing fleets that should have been entirely destroyed continued operating at reduced capacity. Villages that should have been devastated remained inhabited. The psychological impact on the Greek resistance and civilian population should also be considered. Discovering that they could conduct operations that effectively deceived and misdirected one of the world's most advanced militaries must have provided a profound sense of agency and efficacy. At a time when much of the Mediterranean population was subjected to seemingly invincible Axis power, the dummy gun campaign represented an example of how determination and ingenuity could, at least in modest ways, push back against occupation and victimization.
German intelligence eventually became aware that they had been deceived regarding the Aegean defense network. Captured Greek resistance fighters, interrogated after raids and operations, provided information about the dummy gun campaign. German officers who survived the war and were later interviewed by Allied intelligence personnel discussed the deception they had encountered. After-action reports from German Luftwaffe units operating in the Aegean, preserved in German military archives, occasionally mentioned suspicious anti-aircraft positions and questioned whether reported targets had actually been military installations. Some German intelligence officers noted the surprising frequency with which destroyed positions seemed to reappear or be replaced with new positions in nearby locations. However, German military decision-making continued to account for the apparent Aegean defense network, even after some awareness of the deception became apparent. This reflects a common phenomenon in military deception operations. Once a false picture has been accepted as reality, evidence contradicting that picture is often dismissed or rationalized rather than prompting a complete revision of the strategic picture. A captured German intelligence summary from late 1944 noted in its assessment of Greek forces and defenses that the Aegean Islands possessed formidable coastal defense installations requiring concentrated air and naval assault to overcome. This assessment, written when the strategic situation in Europe was clearly shifting against Germany, and when German forces were being withdrawn from Greece, still reflected the inflated estimate of Aegean defenses that the dummy gun campaign had helped establish. This is perhaps the ultimate testament to the success of the deception. It persisted in German military thinking, even when German military personnel possessed evidence that contradicted it.
The Greek fishermen's dummy gun campaign remains one of the least known and least celebrated deception operations of World War II. While the Ghost Army has achieved posthumous fame, while Operation Fortitude is studied in military academies, while the British bombing decoys are noted in historical accounts of the air war, the Aegean fishing community's contribution to deception strategy has been largely forgotten. Part of this obscurity reflects the scale of the operation. It was conducted by civilians, not organized military units. It produced no dramatic operational victories, no single decisive moment. It worked through gradual accumulation and marginal effects rather than sudden reversals. It was fundamentally defensive, focused on protecting lives and livelihoods rather than advancing military objectives.
Part of the obscurity also reflects the broader historical tendency to focus on military operations and overlook civilian agency and resistance. The fishermen of the Aegean were not professionally trained soldiers. They were not conducting the operation under direct military command. They were ordinary people responding to existential threat with available resources and collective ingenuity. Yet the campaign deserves recognition as a remarkable example of civilian resilience and tactical creativity. The fishermen demonstrated that deception operations need not be conducted by military specialists with vast resources. With observation, improvisation, and community participation, ordinary people could conduct operations that misdirected military planning and saved lives. The campaign also represents an important dimension of World War II that is often overlooked: the role of civilian populations not merely as victims of occupation, but as active participants in resistance and survival strategies. The Greek fishermen were not passive recipients of occupation policy, but agents determining their own survival through their own ingenuity. Military historians and defense strategists studying the Aegean deception campaign have drawn several important lessons that influenced post-war thinking about deception operations. First, the campaign demonstrated the limitations of aerial reconnaissance. Despite the technical sophistication of German reconnaissance aircraft and the training of German photoanalysts, large-scale deception was possible through careful attention to appearance, positioning, and operational security. The lesson was that even advanced intelligence systems could be deceived through systematic application of basic principles. Second, the campaign illustrated the importance of feedback loops in deception operations. The Luftwaffe's bombing runs on dummy positions, followed by post-raid reconnaissance photography, created a feedback loop that reinforced the false picture of the Aegean defense network. Each bombing run appeared to confirm the reality of the deception. This principle would inform post-war deception theory, which emphasizes the importance of providing feedback to the enemy that reinforces false impressions. Third, the campaign demonstrated the value of distributed, decentralized deception. Unlike centralized deception operations that could be compromised if key personnel or command centers were captured, the distributed nature of the Aegean campaign meant that loss of one position or exposure of one deception did not compromise the entire operation. The resistance could continue constructing new dummy positions even if individual operations were discovered. Fourth, the campaign showed the relationship between physical deception and psychological factors. The deception succeeded not merely because the dummy guns looked real, but because German planners, operating with incomplete information, psychological pressure to demonstrate effective air operations, and bureaucratic incentives to report successful bombing missions, were willing to accept the deception. This demonstrated that physical deception works best when it aligns with the target's expectations and desires.
While the broad outlines of the dummy gun campaign can be reconstructed from documentary evidence and post-war interviews, the individual stories of those who participated remain largely lost to history. But scattered accounts from resistance memoirs, post-war interviews, and oral histories preserve fragments of these personal narratives. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the testimony of Dimitri Stavros, a fisherman from Mykonos who participated in constructing dummy positions on his island. In a 1955 interview with a Greek historian, Stavros recalled the first discussions among the fishing community about the deception campaign. It was not, he explained,
a moment of grand strategic revelation. It was desperation. "We watched our boats burn," Stavros said. "Every week, another bombing run. The Germans would see fishing vessels leaving harbor and strafe them from the air. 3 boats sunk in 1 week in June 1942, 37 men dead. My cousin among them. We couldn't fish, we couldn't eat, we couldn't do anything but wait to die." It was an older fisherman, according to Stavros' account, who first suggested the dummy guns. This man, whose name has been lost, reportedly said something like, "If the Germans are looking for military targets, let's give them military targets. Let's make them so interesting they forget about the harbor." The construction of the first dummy positions on Mykonos was chaotic and improvised. Stavros described scavenging materials from abandoned military sites, salvaging wood from wrecked buildings, and using paint from fishing vessels. The positions were placed on the rocky hills overlooking the harbor, deliberately in locations where bombing would cause damage to terrain, but not to structures or people. "We didn't know if it would work," Stavros recalled. "We were just trying something. The first time we saw the dust from bombing near one of our positions, we didn't celebrate. We were terrified. We thought for certain the Germans would realize what we had done and execute us all. But nothing happened. No arrests, no reprisals. The bombing stopped for a few weeks. The boats came out to fish. We caught enough to eat." Similar accounts from other islands describe the gradual expansion of the campaign through a process of trial and error. Communities that heard rumors of successful deception elsewhere would attempt similar operations. Some worked better than others. Some attracted bombing that was more intense than expected. But the accumulated effect across all the islands was a measurable reduction in bombing pressure on harbors and fishing villages. One of the most remarkable aspects of the campaign, according to survivors' accounts, was the discipline maintained by communities to prevent discovery. German occupation forces occasionally conducted patrols, specifically looking for evidence of resistance activity. If construction materials were found, if dummy positions were discovered before being properly concealed, if anyone was captured and interrogated about the campaign, entire communities could face execution. The silence was absolute. Despite hundreds or potentially thousands of people across multiple islands being aware of the campaign, German forces apparently never launched a significant investigation or crackdown specifically targeting the dummy gun operation. This suggests either that Germans remained genuinely unaware of the deception's civilian origin, or that they discovered it but chose not to publicize or act on the information in ways that would have left a documentary trail. Another survivor, a woman named Antonia Papadopoulos from Paros, described her participation in the campaign. She was in her early 20s during the occupation and worked with other women in her village constructing and maintaining dummy positions. Her account, recorded in a 1978 oral history interview, provides insight into the role of women in the campaign, a dimension often overlooked in historical discussions. The men, some of them were away, either captured or in the mountains with the resistance, so the women and older men did much of the work. We built the positions. We painted them. We made sure they looked correct. When bombing happened, we would go out after and rebuild them if necessary. Some of us worked at night. Some worked during the day when German patrols were less frequent. She described the tension of the work, the constant fear of discovery, and the strange mixture of hope and terror when bombing runs occurred.
You wanted the Germans to bomb the dummy positions, but you were terrified that something would go wrong, that a bomb would miss, that it would hit the village instead. So it was this constant tension, hope and fear at the same time. Papadopoulos also described the broader social dimensions of the campaign. It required community consensus and participation. Resources had to be pooled. Labor had to be shared. Leadership emerged, though it was typically informal. Respected fishermen, priests, village elders, who coordinated the effort without formal military rank or authority. There was a priest, Papadopoulos recalled, Father Yannis, who helped organize much of the work on Pauros. He would think about where the positions should be placed. He would make sure people were working safely. But he wasn't a military commander. He was just someone the village trusted. A particularly poignant account comes from the testimony of Nikos Papadopoulos, a resistance fighter who operated on several Aegean islands and worked with the fishing communities on dummy gun construction. In a post-war memoir, Papadopoulos described the operations as representing a form of civilian resistance that was fundamentally different from armed operations. The armed resistance, the ELAS fighters and the resistance cells, we fought the Germans directly. We conducted sabotage. We killed German soldiers when we could. We gathered intelligence. This was our role. But the fishermen did something different. They created a form of protection through deception. They deceived the enemy not with weapons, but with wit. It was, in its way, more remarkable, because it required absolute discipline, absolute secrecy, and absolute community participation. One person talking could have destroyed everything. These individual accounts, fragments as they are, provide a human dimension to the campaign that statistics and strategic analysis cannot capture. They describe ordinary people, fishermen, women, priests, village elders, conducting an extraordinary operation not because they were soldiers or because they had been ordered to do so, but because they faced extinction and they refused to accept it.
One of the remarkable aspects of the dummy gun campaign is that its origins remain unclear. Unlike military operations, which typically have documented orders, planning sessions, and command structure, the civilian deception campaign emerged organically from communities facing crisis. No single person can be credited as its originator. No headquarters coordinated it. It evolved through trial and error across multiple communities simultaneously. This diffusion of origin has made historical attribution nearly impossible. Greek historians and researchers who have studied the campaign in the decades after the war have attempted to trace its beginnings to specific communities or individuals, but the evidence is anecdotal and contradictory. Some accounts suggest the campaign began on Mykonos or Paros. Others point to Naxos or Samos. Still others claim it was initiated on smaller, less documented islands, where documentation is sparse and survivors have died. The truth is probably that similar ideas emerged independently on multiple islands as communities facing identical circumstances, Luftwaffe bombing campaigns and fishing-dependent economies came to similar conclusions about deception and defense. This points to a fascinating aspect of human creativity and survival instinct, that similar solutions often emerge independently when faced with similar problems. just as the Australians and British developed camouflage techniques independently during the Boer War before discovering they had invented the same concept. The Greek fishing communities likely developed dummy gun positions independently or through loose and informal communication rather than through a centrally coordinated plan. As the strategic situation shifted in 1944 and 1945, with Germany facing defeat on multiple fronts, the Aegean campaign gradually wound down. The Luftwaffe, facing increasing losses in fighters and bombers and diminishing fuel supplies, conducted fewer bombing operations. German troop strength in the Aegean was gradually reduced as personnel and equipment were withdrawn for deployment in more critical theaters. By early 1945, German forces in the Aegean were largely static, holding positions on major islands and strategic harbors, but lacking the power to conduct major offensive operations. The dummy gun campaign, which had been most relevant during the period of intense Axis bombing and air operations, became less critical as Axis air activity diminished. The final months of the occupation saw a gradual wind-down of resistance activity and deception operations, as it became increasingly clear that Germany would lose the war. In May 1945, German forces in the Aegean surrendered to Allied forces, ending the occupation. In the aftermath of the war, the dummy gun campaign was largely forgotten. It had not resulted in any dramatic military victory. It had not prevented any major bombing raid through overt defensive action. It had operated in subtle, cumulative ways that were difficult to document or verify. As post-war historical accounts focused on the major theaters of war and the decisive military operations, the story of Greek fishermen's deception faded into obscurity.
In the decades following World War II, the dummy gun campaign gradually came to light through the scattered accounts of survivors and resistance fighters. Greek historians, particularly those interested in the Greek resistance movement, began documenting the campaign through oral histories and survivor interviews. International military historians, studying the broader topic of deception in World War II, eventually encountered references to the Greek campaign and began investigating. What emerged was recognition that this civilian-directed deception operation represented a significant and previously overlooked contribution to the broader war effort and to survival in occupied territories. Academic works on deception operations, while acknowledging the campaign's existence, typically relegated it to footnotes and brief sections, perhaps because it lacked the dramatic documentation of military deception operations, or because it was conducted by civilians rather than professional military personnel. But in recent years, as historians have become increasingly interested in civilian experiences of occupation and in the agency of ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances, the dummy gun campaign has received renewed scholarly attention. Graduate students have written dissertations analyzing the campaign's impact on bombing patterns. Researchers have attempted to quantify the diversion of ordnance and sorties. Oral histories have been collected from aging survivors before their first-hand accounts are lost to time. What emerges from this modern scholarship is a picture of a remarkable civilian deception operation that, while limited in its immediate military impact, was significant in several ways. It preserved civilian livelihoods and lives that might otherwise have been lost.
It demonstrated the capacity of ordinary people to conduct sophisticated military deception without formal training. It represented a form of resistance that was fundamentally different from armed resistance, not opposition through force of arms, but through creativity and collective action. To place the Greek fishermen's campaign in proper historical context, we can compare it with other civilian and civilian military deception operations conducted during World War II. The most famous civilian deception operation was Operation Fortitude, which involved elaborate deception of German High Command regarding the location and timing of the D-Day invasion. Fortitude involved military planners, intelligence specialists, and specially constructed dummy installations, all coordinated under military command. It succeeded brilliantly and is widely recognized as one of the war's most significant strategic operations. The Ghost Army, formerly the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was a U.S. Army unit that specialized in tactical deception using inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and sound effects. The Ghost Army conducted numerous operations that deceived German commanders into misdeploying forces or overestimating Allied strength. The unit's operations are extensively documented and have become the subject of books and a documentary film. British decoys and dummy installations built to protect airfields and manufacturing facilities from the Luftwaffe bombing are well documented and frequently cited in accounts of the air war. These operations involved constructing fake towns, airfields, and military installations to draw bombing away from real targets. What distinguishes the Greek fishermen's campaign is its origin in civilian populations, its organic and improvisational nature, and its focus on protecting civilian livelihoods rather than military installations or strategic objectives. While the other operations involved military coordination and resources, the Greek campaign emerged from community action and was sustained through collective participation.
The Greek fishermen's dummy gun campaign represents an important example of how civilian populations can resist occupation not merely through armed resistance or passive acceptance, but through creative and collective action directed at survival and self-protection. Throughout World War II, occupied populations employed various forms of resistance, ranging from armed partisan warfare to civil disobedience to economic sabotage. The dummy gun campaign represents a lesser-known category, civilian-directed tactical deception for survival purposes. This form of resistance has several characteristics that distinguish it from other resistance modalities. It required no weapons and thus no military supplies or training. It could be conducted by entire communities rather than by specialized resistance fighters. It posed less direct risk to participants than armed resistance, but required absolute discipline and secrecy. It succeeded through alignment with enemy military incentives and information processes, rather than through opposition to enemy forces. The campaign also demonstrates a principle that would influence post-war thinking about resistance and survival in occupied territories, that civilian populations possess agency and can take actions to improve their own circumstances, even under conditions of occupation by militarily superior forces. This principle would be relevant in post-war discussions about civil resistance, nonviolent resistance movements, and the capacity of ordinary people to resist authoritarianism through collective action. The Greek fishermen's campaign, while not typically cited in these discussions,
represents an early example of this principle in operation. Beyond the historical significance of the campaign itself, the dummy guns have left material evidence. Some of the wooden and metal structures from the campaign still existed decades after the war, deteriorating on Greek island hillsides. Researchers and historians have occasionally photographed or studied these remnants, attempting to understand the construction techniques and materials used. In some cases, the structures are so weathered and overgrown that they blend with the landscape. In other cases, particularly where stone was used in construction, the structures are more visible, though often misidentified by tourists and casual observers as old military installations from various periods, rather than as World War II civilian deceptions. The Greek Ministry of Culture and various historical societies have, in recent years, attempted to document and preserve some of these structures as historical artifacts of World War II. Some proposals have been made to establish sites as historical monuments, or to incorporate them into war history museums. However, the scattered nature of the installations, their remote locations on many islands, and the lack of comprehensive documentation have made systematic preservation difficult. The material legacy is also present in the landscapes themselves. The bombing craters from German airstrikes on the dummy positions, now decades old and partially filled by erosion and vegetation, dot Greek island hillsides. These craters, while no longer visible without careful observation, represent the physical evidence of the deception campaign's success. Bombs fell where the fishermen intended them to fall, rather than on the inhabited areas below.
In examining the Greek fishermen's dummy gun campaign, modern observers might identify parallels with contemporary civilian responses to conflict and disaster. The principles that made the campaign successful, community coordination, improvisation with available resources, discipline in maintaining operational security, willingness to accept marginal improvements in survival circumstances, remain relevant to contemporary discussions of civilian resilience and agency under duress. The campaign also raises questions about the role of deception in civilian defense. In modern conflicts, civilian populations sometimes employ camouflage, concealment, and deception tactics to reduce targeting by military forces. The sophistication of modern surveillance, satellite imagery, digital intelligence, precision weapons creates different challenges than those faced by fishermen deceiving 1940s Luftwaffe reconnaissance. But the principles remain relevant. How can civilian populations make themselves less attractive targets? How can deception be employed as a defensive tactic? The campaign also suggests that civilian populations, while typically depicted as passive victims in historical accounts of warfare, can be active agents in their own defense and survival. This has implications for how we understand and analyze occupied populations, refugee populations, and populations living under threat. As this script is written in 2025, most of the fishermen and civilians who participated in the dummy gun campaign are deceased. The oldest survivors would now be in their late 80s or 90s, if any remain alive. The living memory of the campaign, the ability to speak with those who built the guns, who participated in construction, who saw the bombing runs, is rapidly disappearing. This creates urgency for historical documentation and preservation. Oral histories recorded in recent decades capture some of these accounts,
But as survivors die, direct testimony becomes impossible. Historians must increasingly rely on written accounts, published memoirs, and archived interviews rather than new testimony from participants. This phenomenon, the disappearance of living memory, is common to all historical events that occurred more than 80 years ago. But it is particularly acute for operations like the dummy gun campaign that did not generate extensive contemporaneous written documentation. A military operation, by contrast, produces orders, reports, intelligence assessments, and after-action reviews that create a documentary trail. The civilian deception campaign, conducted covertly and without formal military structure, generated no such documentation during the war. As living memory fades, the campaign risks becoming entirely forgotten or relegated to obscure historical footnotes. Preserving what remains of survivor testimony and encouraging historical research become increasingly important. Beyond the material and strategic dimensions of the campaign, there were significant psychological dimensions that deserve consideration. For the German occupation forces and military personnel, the dummy gun campaign, if discovered or suspected, would have represented a troubling realization that they could be deceived, that intelligence information they relied upon might be falsified, that the information picture of the occupied territory might not correspond to reality. In military operations, such uncertainties are sources of significant stress and concern. For the Greek civilian population, the campaign represented something different, the possibility of agency, of taking action that could influence their own circumstances, the discovery that they could conduct operations that misdirected German military effort, that they could protect their livelihoods through ingenuity rather than being purely passive victims of occupation, likely had significant morale effects. Post-war interviews and accounts suggest that the campaign did indeed produce psychological benefits for participants. They described it as empowering, as evidence that they were not completely powerless in the face of occupation. This psychological dimension should be considered alongside any material assessment of the campaign's military impact. For German pilots and crews, if they became aware that they had been bombing dummy positions, the psychological effect would have been humiliation. To discover that one's bombing missions, conducted at risk of life, had been directed at deceptions rather than real military targets would have been deeply demoralizing. There is some evidence from German accounts that this realization did occur, at least among some personnel, by late in the war.
Military strategists and historians analyzing the Greek fishermen's campaign have identified several lessons that influenced post-war thinking about deception, resilience, and civilian-military interactions. First, the campaign demonstrated that deception could be conducted successfully at the tactical and operational levels without massive resources or formal military organization. This had implications for how military theorists thought about the requirements for conducting deception operations. Second, the campaign illustrated the importance of information and decision-making processes in military operations. The Luftwaffe's deception was successful not primarily because the dummy guns looked perfect, but because German pilots and commanders operating with incomplete information and under pressure to achieve military objectives accepted information that confirmed their existing expectations. This insight influenced post-war thinking about how to design effective deceptions. by aligning false information with target expectations and desires. Third, the campaign demonstrated the value of distributed, resilient resistance systems. Unlike centralized deception operations that could be compromised, the distributed nature of the Aegean campaign meant it could survive discovery of individual elements without being entirely destroyed. Fourth, the campaign showed that civilian populations could contribute to military objectives not just as soldiers, but through their own distinctive capabilities. In this case, intimate knowledge of local terrain, construction skills, and ability to mobilize community resources. These lessons would influence military doctrine and defense strategy in the post-war period, including the development of civilian defense concepts, resilience theory, and non-military approaches to security challenges. From the perspective of international law and the laws of war, the dummy gun campaign occupies an ambiguous position. The Geneva Conventions and international laws of war permit military deception. Armies are allowed to camouflage positions, employ false intelligence, and conduct ruses to confuse enemies. However, international law also establishes protections for civilian populations and prohibits certain forms of targeting. If German forces had discovered the dummy gun campaign and determined that it constituted a coordinated military deception operation, could they have justified reprisals against the civilian population conducting it? This is a complex legal and ethical question that international law experts would likely disagree about. In practical terms, German occupation forces never launched systematic reprisals specifically targeting the dummy gun campaign. Whether this reflected ignorance of the campaign's existence, uncertainty about its legality under laws of war, or simply the chaos of occupation and the focus of military attention on other matters remains unclear. The question does raise important issues about the status of civilian participants in deception operations. The distinction between legitimate military deception and illegitimate uses of civilian populations, and the ethics of civilian participation in warfare, even in non-combat roles. The dummy gun campaign, conducted in 1941-1945, was fundamentally limited by the technology available to both the Greeks conducting the deception and the Germans attempting to detect targets. Modern technology would have made the campaign far more difficult or impossible. Contemporary satellite imagery, for instance, can identify the difference between real and dummy military installations with high accuracy. Thermal imaging can detect the heat signatures that would distinguish real military operations from inactive decoys. Drone reconnaissance, which can hover over an area and observe it in detail for extended periods, would quickly identify decoys that showed no signs of operational activity. Modern radar systems, rather than relying primarily on visual identification and photography, use radio signals to detect installations, making visual camouflage irrelevant for many purposes. Digital communications intercepts could reveal the nature of installations through radio traffic analysis rather than physical observation. The implication is that civilian deception operations of the type conducted by Greek fishermen would be far more difficult in a modern context. This has interesting implications for how civilian populations might respond to conflict or bombing campaigns. The technologies that make conventional deception more difficult might push civilian populations toward other forms of resilience or resistance. The Greek fishermen's dummy gun campaign represents one of World War II's most remarkable yet least celebrated examples of civilian agency, creativity, and collective action in response to occupation and threat. Over the course of 4 years, fishing communities across the Aegean Islands constructed hundreds of wooden and canvas decoys designed to divert German bombing runs from their harbors and villages to empty hillsides. The campaign succeeded through a combination of factors: intimate local knowledge of terrain and German military procedures, improvisation with available materials, absolute community discipline and secrecy, and a willingness to accept significant personal risk. It succeeded because it aligned with German military incentives and information processes, because deceiving German pilots meant less bombing of actual population centers. The campaign's strategic impact, while difficult to quantify precisely, was meaningful. It likely saved hundreds of lives, preserved a fishing industry that might otherwise have been entirely destroyed, and contributed to the survival of Aegean communities through 4 years of occupation. But beyond the strategic impact, the campaign represents something more significant: evidence of human resilience, creativity, and capacity for collective action under impossible circumstances. Ordinary fishermen, without military training, without formal authority, and without government resources, conducted an operation of military sophistication that confused and misdirected a modern military force. The campaign deserves to be remembered not as a decisive military operation, but as a testament to what ordinary people can accomplish when facing existential threat with determination and ingenuity. It deserves to be studied and understood as an example of civilian resistance and resilience that transcends the typical categories of armed combat. In May 1945, when German forces in the Aegean finally surrendered and occupation ended, the fishing communities emerged from 4 years of war, having protected their livelihoods and their lives through an operation conducted with no weapons except wit, no authority except community consensus, and no resources except what they could improvise from materials at hand. The Luftwaffe pilots who had laughed at the threat posed by Greek fishing villages and bombed what they believed to be military targets never knew that they had been engaged in combat with an enemy they could not see and would not have recognized as such. They never knew that the dust and explosions of their bombing runs were the sound of Greek fishermen's victory, a quiet, invisible victory achieved through deception, courage, and the determination to survive. In the decades after the war, the dummy guns deteriorated on Greek hillsides, slowly consumed by weather and time. Some collapsed into rubble, others were dismantled or repurposed. Eventually, few physical traces remained, but the memory persisted in the minds of survivors and gradually, through historical research and documentation, in the collective historical record. Today, the campaign serves as a reminder of a fundamental principle: that military superiority, advanced technology, and organized force can be engaged by ordinary people through intelligence, creativity, and collective action. The Aegean fishermen proved that one need not be a soldier to wage war, that one need not carry weapons to conduct military operations, and that resilience and survival can sometimes be achieved through means as simple as wood, canvas, and paint, and the courage to use them against impossible odds. The thunder of Luftwaffe bombers no longer echoes over the Aegean. The fishermen have returned to their waters, the islands have healed, but the legacy of those who built the dummy guns remain, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of occupation and evidence that even ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, can shape the course of history.